Welcome to Science Week. My name is Alan Walsh and here I am at Kilfarcy Beach on the Copper Coast Geopark here in County Waterford. We're going to look at the family's favourite habitat, which is the rocky seashore. The rocky seashore is where the sea meets the land and the bit in between. And we're going to look at how it is broken up into different zones. Firstly, we're going to start off with what's known as the splash zone. Then we'll move down onto the upper seashore, middle and then the lower seashore and discover what type of animals and wildlife that you can find here. Right up here at the seashore edge, we're at what's known as the splash zone. This area of the seashore only gets exposed by water on extremely high tides and when it's actually stormy. But there is life in fact here. If we look really closely at this rock, we can see tiny little snails. These are known as rough periwinkles, and they have adapted to live right on the edge of where the land meets. Maybe if we came back here millions of years, we might in fact even find these snails after evolving into our own gardens. Alongside the snail, there is a type of lichen that grows here. The lichen has a symbiosis relationship between an algae and a fungus. The fungus creates the structure for the algae to survive, and the algae then takes the sunlight and turns that into simple sugars so the fungus can actually feed on it. So it's very clever the way it works. But also, not only does it grow here, which is called a black tar lichen. Some people may think it's actually the colour of the rock, where in fact it is actually the lichen. But it excretes a very minute acid that can actually help break down the rock, which creates simple soils for plants then to take hold, and you see biodiversity then starting to take place in succession to carry on. So when you look up at a cliff's edge, you might see sea pinks and sea campiums growing, and that's thanks to these lichens that are helping take the nutrients out of this solid rock. We've made our way from the splash zone down into the upper seashore. Then life is starting to get a bit more diverse, even just a few feet away from the splash zone. We can see barnacles are starting to encrust the rocks. Barnacles are fascinating creatures, very closely related to lobsters and crabs. They start off as part of the zooplankton soup in our ocean, and they have a small suction cup on top of their head where they cling onto the rocks and their legs are left flailing around in the ocean until they create a shell made out of the calcium that they extract from the seawater. Their legs then are adapted to like fishing nets so they can catch other plankton in the water stream. Up in the upper seashore too, there's different species of algae starting to form. One that's in my hand here is called sea lava, and this is used in making bread. In many ways it's dried out and then crushed down and added to bread, so lava rack bread. So that's always very, very much a favourite for people to use, and you'll find it cast over the rocks, hence its name. It does kind of look like lava spilling off of the rocks. Also, you'll find different types of racks, such as bladder rack and channel rack, and these are also other types of algae that hold fast to the rocks here on the seashore.
One thing that always amazes me about the rocky seashore is when you get to find one of these rock pools. It really brings you back to your childhood memories of exploring rocks on the beach, and even as an adult you'll still enjoy finding these type of rock pools. It's absolutely teeming with life. Different types of algae, different types of snails and crustaceans that live in here. And the amazing thing about it is when you first come up to them, you might not see a lot actually happening because what's living in here hides away, because you can feel the vibrations of your foot. But if you just sit here or stand there close to the rock pool, over time you'll start to see fish starting to move around. You might even see crabs. Hey, you might be even lucky to see a hermit crab or even a starfish that lives in this area. Now we're moving down towards the middle seashore, but you end up getting these crevice habitats where a little bit of the upper and lower and the middle all kind of blend together. So what we're looking at in this rock pool is the algae. We have some what's called sea lettuce, very like the lettuce you get in a supermarket, totally different taste though. And you get the all famous carrageen moss, which is also known as Irish moss. Carrageen moss is used in many recipes as like a gelatin, but it's a vegan one. So it can be used for making your chocolate mousses, your cheesecakes, and even in stews as well. So it's a pretty good seaweed to find. And you might see this kind of pinkish, reddish kind of seaweed. This is known as coral weed. And it actually does feel like coral even to the touch. It has a kind of a calcium coating on the outside and it's quite rough. And then you have this other pink algae that's covering this whole upper edge of this rock pool. This is an encrusting algae as well. There is animals, in fact, that feed on this algae. So I have these little top shells that live within the rocks and also in the rock pool. These graze away when the tide is in and they feed on the actual algae. And to protect themselves, they have a small little covering that they can seal in that valuable drop of water when the tide recedes. And of course, everyone might recognize this one. This is the edible periwinkle. Many people from many generations have spent a lot of time exploring the rocky seashore to find this food, and it's often eaten with a small pin. It doesn't look that edible looking once it's cooked, but believe you me, if you're out surviving, that's the protein that you need. Now, not all snails, of course, are herbivores. There is, in fact, carnivorous or carnivore snails, which this one is called the dogwelk. Dogwelk has a fascinating way of finding its food. It has a trumpet-like piece that comes out through the slit in the shell and it sniffs the water around for its prey. Its prey may be limpets, periwinkles. It could also be barnacles, stationary, very easy to catch, and also mussels too. They first drill a small hole with their mouth parts on the shell and ingest an enzyme that dissolves down the mussel tissue inside, basically making themselves a protein smoothie to get themselves going for the day. But that's the dogwelk. Keep an eye out for those. They range from very small to the size of your hand. You might have often found those washed up on the seashore, to the ones that you listen to the ocean. Now, there is also some soft-bodied animals living in the seashore or in the rock pool, such as sea anemones. Some of the sea anemones that you find along the Irish coastline range from the strawberry anemone to the beadlet anemone and the snake-lox anemone. Both the beadlet and the strawberry anemone can survive outside water by covering themselves over with a protective membrane. And once the tide comes in, they open up like a flowering flower and they catch the small little invertebrates and the small zooplankton particles that are in the water with their stinging tentacles, and their mouth is towards their middle of their body. However, the snake-lox anemone lives permanently in a rock pool and it's always opened up. It's very easy to identify as well. It has long tentacles. Usually it's a brown, purple or purpley green, very fluorescent kind of a colour. So when you're down on a rock seashore, take the time and look in a rock pool.
Unfortunately today, due to the weather conditions, we couldn't make it down onto the lower seashore. It's always important to put safety first when exploring the seashore. Never walk on wet rocks. Always tell someone where you're going. Make sure the tide is going out and there's not a storm blowing. So we've actually been lucky enough to find a lot of the members of the kelp family that we would have found down at the lower seashore today. We have a seaweed called furbelow, which has a wrinkly end just before the holdfast, which looks like the root end. In fact, seaweeds don't have any roots at all. They have a holdfast that allows them to attach onto the rock to survive most of the storms that we get here on the coastline. We also have other types of kelps as well, such as oarweed, and it's easily identified by the frond end, which is the finger looking end of the seaweed. It nearly looks like an oar where it's attached to the scype, which is in fact like the stem of the algae. And you might find seabelt as well, which is a long seaweed that looks in fact like a belt. And two, within those kelp forests, as we call them, there are very important habitats for many fish species along our coastline, such as sea bass, pollock, also small wrasse that live in amongst the seaweed that can be seen while snorkeling along our coastline. These also ocean-going fish such as cod come into these inshore waters to grow larger before they go off out to sea. this time of year, as it is getting into autumn, the Celtic Sea becomes a rich ground for herring and sprat. And along with those herring and sprat, you'll find some whales, such as the minke whale and the fin whale, and occasionally the humpback whale, with the minke whale being the most popular sighted whale along our coastline.
Our oceans are such a valuable resource. Every time we take a breath, we're taking in the oxygen from our oceans, created by the phytoplankton that forms huge swarms of algae within our oceans that converts carbon dioxide into valuable oxygen. Also, for conservation, we really need to be mindful of how we care for our oceans. We have one Earth, and our oceans is a big part of that. Every year we see the changes due to climate change to our surrounding coastlines, such as erosion and invasive species becoming more prevalent every year. Also, another threat to our oceans is plastics, such as the microplastics, which are smaller than a 20-cent piece, are littering our beaches with every tide, and not only getting up onto our tide, but getting into our own food. So be mindful when we do go to our beaches that we take away the litter that we bring. It's much easier to take away empty cartons than a full one, and so that we keep a pristine environment for us now and for future generations for the future.
We found a very interesting find here on Kilfarcy Beach. We found the remains of a ballan, and this is the teeth structure of the classification of whales within the ballan family of minke, fin, and also the largest mammal in our oceans, the blue whale. How these whales actually feed is they take in large gulps of water containing their food, which could be either krill, plankton, sprats, herring, and then they exhale out the water, and these teeth-like structures, or these feathery-like structures, capture the food and don't allow them out. And this is very interesting find, because not too often you get to see ballan up close like this, because it's generally inside a whale's mouth.
Hope you enjoyed the delights from the rocky seashore here in the Copper Coast Geopark as part of the Science Week.